The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Support provided by Milwaukee Public Television and the UWM Center for International Education. Now here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. With 95% of the world's consumers located outside the U.S., people on both sides of the political aisle acknowledge the need for American companies to be active in the global marketplace. How the regulatory environment is structured to encourage this, however, is a subject of considerable debate. In a stark departure from previous Republican standard-bearers, the presumptive nominee, Donald Trump, has characterized recent trade deals as, quote, no good for us and no good for our workers. Our guest today is a strong supporter of the kind of U.S. trade agreements that Mr. Trump and other candidates find problematic. John Murphy is Senior Vice President for International Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, a Washington, D.C. organization representing more than 3 million businesses nationwide. He directs the Chamber's international trade and investment policy advocacy efforts before Congress, the administration, foreign governments, and the WTO. John Murphy, welcome to International Focus.
It's great to be here today.
Well, maybe you could start by just giving us a sense of where the U.S. is with the number of free trade agreements, sort of in comparison to some other countries around the world.
Well, over the years, trade has become more and more important to the U.S. economy. And today, it's more than 40 million American jobs that depend on trade. It's especially important in manufacturing, where we see between 1 in 4, 1 in 3 factory jobs depend on exports, and farming as well. 1 in 3 acres on American farms is planted for exports. Now, the trade agreements that are under debate here in this political year have been especially important to American workers and farmers and companies because what they do is they tear down the barriers in foreign markets, the tariffs and taxes and other kinds of rules that shut out U.S.-made goods and services. That's why we've been able, through these trade agreements with 20 countries, to see exports grow 3 times as fast as they have to other parts of the world, so that those countries today purchase 12 times as much in terms of U.S. goods and services as other countries do. So we're very frustrated in the business community that the utility of these agreements and what they mean for American jobs here at home has been lost in the debate, at least so far.
So you mentioned the number 20. So currently there are 20 agreements in place between the U.S. government and elsewhere. How does that compare to other parts of the world? I mean, do other countries have more agreements, less agreements? Where do we stand on that scale?
Well, the world is very interested in trade agreements today. And according to the World Trade Organization, there are more than 400 of these agreements in force between different countries, and many more are under negotiation. Some countries like Chile or Mexico or the European Union have dozens of them in the place. So the United States with about 20 is a relatively small number. And this can be a problem for American competitiveness because if you think about it, if Chileans or Mexicans or Europeans, if they're able to get into some other market in Southeast Asia or Japan or wherever, and they're able to sell their goods without paying that tariff at the border, which can be 12 points or higher, then that's an advantage. And their goods are going to get in, they're more likely to get the sale. So falling behind in the push for these trade agreements is a real problem. And unfortunately, it's only getting worse. What we're seeing today is that in East Asia in particular, which is where you have literally hundreds of millions of people joining the middle class and buying more goods from the United States and other places in the world, they're negotiating a big new trade pact amongst themselves, and the United States is going to be on the outside looking in. So the challenges to American competitiveness are tough, but what we find in particular is that by standing still, we fall behind. So this adds a sense of urgency to the need to move forward on international trade today.
So, one of the first big multilateral agreements that people would be familiar with, of course, is NAFTA, and we're now a few decades out from that. And I think what is not under debate is the number of U.S. manufacturing jobs has definitely gone down since that agreement went in force. So how much of that could you attribute to the idea of jobs going overseas versus other factors?
Well, it's interesting because there's a lot of discussion about job loss, and manufacturing is indeed a sector where the United States has seen job losses. Those job losses, though, started in 1979 and have, through today, we've seen periods of mostly decline. Actually, in the late 90s, they rose shortly after NAFTA came into force. But we're seeing fewer jobs in the manufacturing sector. That's not the same thing, though, as manufacturing decline. In fact, over the past 20, 25 years, U.S. manufacturing output in real terms has almost doubled in this country. U.S. manufacturers today have never produced so much. They've never had revenues as high as this. They have record profits. What we've seen, though, is a productivity revolution where the introduction of new, more sophisticated capital goods, robotics, information technologies allows today's manufacturers to produce more and more goods, but they're doing it with fewer workers. So it's important to distinguish here between what's going on in a changing workforce, and across the United States we're seeing more and more jobs in the services sector and fewer in manufacturing. Now, when it comes to trade agreements, often it's easy to blame the foreigners for what's going on here in terms of lost jobs. But if output is up, and up dramatically, as I've said, it's a little disingenuous to blame that on competition from overseas. At NAFTA in particular, and the other trade agreements, what we've seen is that U.S. exports to these countries have grown dramatically. Just with NAFTA, U.S. exports have risen fourfold over the past 20 years. And if you look at all the countries amongst which we have trade agreements today, these 20 countries, they represent just 6% of the world's population. But they're buying nearly half of all our exports. I think that's an incredibly powerful, in one sentence, summary of what a trade agreement can do. It can take a small economy and turn it into a big market for made in USA goods and services.
And on just sort of those 20 countries in aggregate, balance of trade issues? I mean, are we buying more of their things? So is it a net gain, or?
Well, the trade balance isn't always a good measure of whether or not your trade policy is succeeding. The last time our trade deficit really fell a lot was during the worst part of our recent recession in 2008, 2009. Meanwhile, you think of the 1990s when the United States had really strong economic growth, the trade deficit expanded. So it's a peculiar barometer. But if you look at those 20 countries, the United States has a trade surplus with them. We have a huge surplus in services, we have a surplus in agricultural goods, and even in manufactured products, which are really important here in Wisconsin. The United States, over the past 7 years, has had, just with NAFTA alone, an $80 billion trade surplus. Now, you'll hear often from the critics and the skeptics and the activists other numbers, but these are the official U.S. government statistics. And I think what it really shows is that when you do have a level playing field, when you get rid of the barriers in foreign markets that shut out U.S.-made goods and services, American workers can compete.
So, obviously there's the aspect of opening markets, but are there other sort of goals and sort of follow-on effects of a successful trade agreement beyond just opening markets?
Well, the Obama administration has talked about how in the upcoming trade agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, they've really tried to address new issues in trade. And I think this is important because the world of trade is changing. So for instance, the digital economy. What I find in my organization, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, is that more and more of our companies are depending on e-commerce and the ability to move data across borders, whether it's an audiovisual company, maybe selling movies across borders over the internet, or even a small business that uses a platform like eBay, we're finding that these new platforms, such as eBay, allow small businesses to reach much larger customer bases. The average one of these small businesses, because they don't have to worry so much about their marketing and the total landed cost on the other end of the trade equation, they can become exporters almost accidentally. So new trade agreements today have provisions in them to facilitate digital commerce as well. And the Obama administration has also put rules in the TPP to shore up labor standards in other countries and to ensure also in the area of environmental protection that countries aren't weakening their environmental protection in order to attract investment and somehow skew the playing field in that fashion.
So, we are a few minutes before our break, and we'll certainly talk about TPP at some length, but talk a little bit about just that process. I mean, how does a very large multilateral agreement like that come into being?
Well, it's not easy. In the case of the TPP, it took 5 years of negotiations. And it started with, I think, 8 or 9 countries, and by the end, additional countries had joined in. And it's very difficult because sometimes you have a dynamic around the table where maybe you have 11 countries who think one thing and the United States says something else. So you don't always get what you want. But at the end of the day, there was, amongst these countries, because there was a common vision, a desire to set a high standard in the trade agreement, to really open up markets and to have really strong rules to protect intellectual property, to crack down on counterfeiting and piracy, to have rules so that state-owned enterprises can't come in and receive favorable treatment in the trade playing field. Because there was that common vision, that's what makes it possible to reach an agreement like that.
So one of the criticisms we often hear about it in terms of process is just lack of transparency. So can you speak to that a little bit? Like who's negotiating on whose behalf?
Sure. Well, the U.S. administration negotiates for the United States and is required by law under the Trade Promotion Authority law approved last year in a bipartisan act by Congress. They are obliged to coordinate closely with Congress. And in addition, the administration has trade advisory committees that bring in representatives of industry, organized labor, environmental groups. Now, the administration does make available through briefings and summaries what they're doing at the negotiating table, but the charge about transparency does come up from time to time. It's a little unfair, though, because at the end of the day, anybody engaged in a negotiation needs to be able to hold their cards close to their chest some of the time. You don't show, if you're playing poker with someone, you don't show them all your cards. If you're a high school football coach, you don't show your game plans to the opposing team. You need to be able to have some discretion in these issues. And so I think for the United States, there's a real effort there to find a balance between openness, participation, and transparency on the one side, and really the ability to get a deal that's going to deliver for American workers and farmers. It just requires a certain discretion.
Well, we can go into that in a little further detail. First, we'll take a short break. We'll be right back.
The Institute of Affairs presents our community with a range of public information about the Institute. At www.
Welcome back. We're discussing the politics of trade policy with John Murphy from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So, before we go too much further, I guess we'd do well to describe TPP and sort of the parameters of what some people say is NAFTA on steroids. It's a very large agreement.
Well, the Trans-Pacific Partnership is a trade agreement among 12 countries, the United States and 11 others around the Pacific Rim, several in Latin America, several in East Asia. It is ambitious because it covers a lot of territory. Between this and the transatlantic agreement that's under negotiation, the United States would be able to have preferential access to more than 40% of the world's trade. 40% in the TPP, for a total of 2/3 between these two agreements. So the stakes are high. The opportunity is huge to tear down those barriers that shut out U.S.-made goods and services. So through these negotiations with these 11 countries, I think the United States has struck a really careful compromise here that achieves the maximum opening for the ability to sell our goods into foreign markets, and at the same time establish rules that are going to be clear and strong, that are going to protect intellectual property and allow governments to continue to do the things that we've always done in terms of regulation to protect safety, health, and the environment.
Well, one aspect of TPP particularly that seems to be the subject of a fair amount of controversy is the dispute settlement, ISDS, Investor State Dispute Settlement Mechanism, which critics would say allow corporations primarily to sort of supersede national law. So, for example, if a country or a corporation felt that a law was somehow prejudicial to their access to a particular market, they could go through this dispute mechanism and bring suit. And so talk to that a little bit. Is that a legitimate concern?
Sure. Well, this kind of investor-state arbitration has been around for decades. It's in over 3,000 treaties around the world. The United States has it with more than 50 countries. But the controversy around it is a bit of a tempest in a teacup. And just to cut to the chase here, even though we have this in so many treaties, it's very rarely invoked. And the United States has actually never lost a case. No corporation has ever brought a dispute against the United States under this investor-state dispute settlement system and won. So it is, however, important as a kind of tool and an admonition that the rule of law should prevail in cases where there's expropriation. We find this is important particularly when we're in a trade or investment agreement with a developing country where the rule of law may not be as strong.
And that really was the origins of these kinds of agreements, right? Where you wouldn't have confidence of prevailing in a local court system,
yes.
So you had to have something to bypass.
Yeah, so governments themselves, they didn't want to have to deal with these disputes, so they said, let's set up an arbitration system where we will choose one arbiter, you choose the other, and then there'll be a process to select the third. Well, but I would just say it's a bit of a tempest in a teacup, not only because the United States has never lost one of these cases, but the charge that this is going to allow anybody to overturn U.S. regulations is nonsense. In fact, if you go in and read the text of these agreements, it says very clearly that regulation to protect health or safety of the environment is protected. It can't be overturned by these procedures.
So let's turn for a moment to the other big agreement being negotiated, and that's TTIP. You talk a little bit about that.
Well, sure. The United States and the European Union are the two big gorillas of the world economy. We each have a GDP of about $18 trillion, and between the two of us, we're about half the world economy. We have a huge amount of trade already with our European friends. If you add in all the investment flows and the services trade, it's more than $6 trillion every year. But it's this idea of having a trade agreement between the U.S. and the EU has been around a long time, and it's been studied a great deal. And what the studies show is that when you have this much trade, even the small barriers we have, such as tariffs that are generally pretty low, getting rid of those can bring big gains because the flow of commerce is so significant. So
if you're
it's
saving
estimated
a few points on a massive amount of trade, then it turns into real money. Right?
Exactly. A trillion here, a trillion there. Pretty soon you're talking real money. No, but seriously, it's And one of the things that is, I think, also a priority with the EU is in the area of regulatory barriers. And again, this isn't talking about anybody lowering their standards of protection for health, safety, or the environment, but sometimes we have regulatory standards that become a trade barrier, maybe even inadvertently. Think, for instance, about car safety. You build a new automobile, Ford has to work with the U.S. regulators and do crash tests to show that it's safe. Well, Mercedes-Benz is doing the same thing with their cars over in Germany. But then should Ford need to crash more cars over in Germany to comply and Mercedes-Benz do the same in the U.S.? No, let's just crash cars once and find a way that's lower cost. It's estimated that these kinds of regulatory cooperation projects with the European Union, they could cut more than 5% off the price of a new car. So we're talking about real money here.
So getting back to the investor-state dispute settlement, that's very much an issue in Europe with the TPP, or I'm sorry, with TTIP. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's certainly what you're hearing from a lot of countries on the European side, that we don't want American corporations to come in and sell us GMO products, for example, that we don't want. And so is there anything to those concerns?
Well, it is funny that this has become, as you say, a real concern in Europe. These investor-state dispute settlement procedures actually have their origin in Germany. Germany invented them, has treaties such as this with countries all around the world. Actually, U.S. companies are not particularly litigious in this matter. I mentioned how there's very few disputes brought here, but we're not bringing these kinds of disputes elsewhere either. European companies have used them more. It's actually more common for mid-sized or smaller companies to use them. Generally, big corporations shy away from it. But I think that in Europe, there's a very well-organized activist network that is set up and that has really endeavored to demonize investor-state arbitration. And they've made real progress, as it were, in getting the public concerned about these procedures, which are made in Europe for Europeans. It's ironic that it's become so controversial.
Well, before we go, I'd like to turn back to our domestic political situation and how it pertains to these issues. I think, as I mentioned in the introduction, it's a somewhat unusual state of affairs when you've got the Republican presumptive nominee railing against trade. I mean, typically it was much more of a partisan kind of issue. That's no longer the case, it seems. So how do we explain that at this moment in our history?
Well, I suppose this is just one of many ways that this year's presidential campaign has been unusual. It's not the first time we've seen trade be controversial in an election year. And I think many of the viewers will remember in 2008 that candidate Obama and candidate Clinton during the primaries spent months criticizing U.S. trade policy. But there's a saying in Washington, where you stand is where you sit. And once you sit in the Oval Office, and you're the president of the United States and the leader of the free world, you're going to want to be able to rely on all the levers and tools of American influence around the world. And that means that if there are relationships you need to shore up or crises that you need to address, you don't want to just rely on the Marines. You want to be able to engage in trade diplomacy as well. And as I mentioned at the beginning, trade has become so important to this country. The benefits of it are the power that trade has to stimulate economic growth here at home is remarkable. Coming out of the recession until today, U.S. exports have risen by more than 50%. The average company, if you can grow your sales by 50% in that period of time, give yourself a bonus. And a third of the jobs created in this period have been in sectors that depend on trade. So I'm confident that at the end of the day, whoever's elected, the day after, like Robert Redford in that movie, The Candidate, he says, now what do we do? One of the things that they're going to want to do is think about a serious plan to promote American trade around the world.
Well, we've got these two very large deals sort of on the table right now. Is there some sort of timeline? I mean, is there hard stop if we don't get it done, or can this negotiation sort of continue on into a new administration and go forward from there?
Well, the transatlantic negotiations are still at maybe kind of a midpoint. They're unlikely to be wrapped up here in the next few weeks or a couple of months. On the other hand, the Trans-Pacific Partnership has been concluded. There are concerns about a couple of provisions there that leaders in Congress are working with the administration to try to address. But I do think that we will see a serious effort to move forward with the TPP in the not distant future. It's kind of a fool's errand in Washington to try and predict when Congress is going to take action on something in particular. That's why we try to focus on the substance, getting the substance right, and that's how we're hopeful that we'll be able to build a bipartisan body of support for moving forward on trade.
Well, that's certainly one to keep watching even after Election Day.
Absolutely.
John Murphy, thank you very much for being with us. To our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
Thank you.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,